That would be great. Thanks so much. All right, so my hope for the few of you who are here and those who are watching live, I hope that I'm not going to be as disappointed. I'm not going to disappoint you too much today. That's the hope, because I know that there's actually some people who have been participating in the seminars and maybe they've dropped off at this point. Oh, thank you, Justin. Because you've been expecting a bit more of an explicit, maybe a more pointed discussion about anarchism. And I got that sense from some people. Today, I actually do have a plan, and it involves speaking more directly on the topic of anarchism. But before doing that, I want to first provide, as I usually do, a sort of broad overview of some of the discoveries that I've made in the last 2 weeks, in the last 2 sessions, this being the third one. I began on the first day by claiming that there's some melancholia, some depression, some melancholia in each of us, in each one of us. But some is already too much. And I think that's a key point. We can't seem to relinquish this too muchness. And it led to a further claim that there's another revolution at stake in melancholia, other than the one that's frequently discussed within modern anarchist discourses. Incidentally, if I've been defending this concept of revolution, then it's because quite precisely it is a Lacanian concept. And perhaps it's even one of the fundamental concepts, since it implies a logic of repetition. And what I discovered was that Lacan's definition of revolution was synonymous, at one time at least, with his definition of the real, namely, that which always returns to its place. I'm just going to make Julie the co-host in case anybody else joins in. So I was led to think about a revolution that doesn't have its point of departure within the world of mastery. And when we speak of these types of revolutions, these sorts of revolutions, we're in essence, we're returning, and maybe this will make Julie happy, which isn't always a good thing to be happy, but we're returning to the Freudian theory of death drive. Moreover, we're broaching death drive as a logic of repetition and fixation. The latter, fixation, being another term for stubbornness, and hence we've spoken of the stubbornness of Antigone, the stubbornness of Stirner, and so on. And it permitted me to separate the revolutionary aspirations from revolutionary impulses. Anarchists haven't spoken very well about revolutionary impulses within anarchism because, frankly, they've always been enigmatic to the anarchists themselves. Ourselves, for some of us. Put simply, the enigmatic impulses demonstrate that revolutions can outlive the subject, not the individual, but the subject. And they show us that it's not necessary at this level to raise questions about representation, like political representation, for example. Although modern anarchists were concerned with, Jesse Cohn had a great book about this. I think it was Jesse Cohn or Nathan John, probably Jesse Cohn, had a great book about this. You know, the modern anarchists were really concerned with epistemic and political representation. But revolutionary impulses open us up to another problem. There are revolutions that repeat without any representation. And it's a different point of departure than those of what I call the revolutionary aspirations, which seek to transgress the laws of the world of mastery and challenge its modes of epistemic and political representation. We see it clearly in the hysterics discourse. The split subject, as Lacan called it, or barred subject, the split subject stages a confrontation with the master signifier, which is the anchoring principle of the world. Lacan's claim, and here's the claim on representation, it's that the signifier represents the subject for another signifier. The signifier represents the subject for another signifier. So the agent of the hysterics discourse for Lacan, which is the split or the barred subject, barred, I didn't say buried or buried subject, that would bring us back to a discussion of melancholy, I think. The barred subject is symbolically torn by signifiers, tormented by representation. The impulses do not partake in this logic because the subject is not at all split by a master signifier at that level. So there's no pitfalls of representation. So it's a worse situation. The subject, it's a worse situation because the subject is set ablaze by the cold flame. I'm saying this for Mark. Mark told me he had to keep his camera off because he's got some things going on, but I hope he can hear this. The cold flame. The subject is set ablaze by the cold flame or the black flame, a black flame of jouissance. The black flame of revolution, the cold flame of revolution is jouissance. Hey, Wen Young. Lacan said, thanks Mark for sharing this quote with me, quote, "The flame is the real, and it sets fire to everything, but it's a cold flame. There is no limit to the high temperatures one may imagine," end quote. I'd give you the full quote, it's even better, but I have a lot I want to say. It reminds me of a point that Russell Grigg made in some paper maybe 10 years ago. I don't remember where. I think it was called The Enigma of Jouissance. It's a great title. The real trauma of jouissance occurs as a consequence of its enigmatic status, because it's enigmatic. It's an enigma outside of the pitfalls of representation. So there's a shift. And it's a shift from a subject torn at either end by signifiers toward one which is not torn by signifiers. The one is a bubble. A bubble, it's a bubble of jouissance, not barred by any signifier necessarily. So to put it really simply, there is on the one hand a split subject, a barred subject, and there is on the other hand maybe something more like now that I said this Freudian slip a moment ago, a buried subject, a subject without splitting. It implies that there's different subjects at stake in the aspirations and in the impulses. On the one hand, there's a subject split by signifiers whose truth might be revealed as being implicated in the totality of the signifying system, as Zizek likes to put it sometimes in the early Lacan. And on the other hand, there's this speaking being taken outside of that totality, a speaking being, which Lacan named in his later teaching parler-être, speaking being. The parler-être is a being who speaks, yes, but with its jouissance. It speaks with its jouissance. She's not torn apart from within by signifiers of the symbolic, which doesn't mean that there isn't a traumatic encounter with the signifier. So the point is that our point of departure changes. We're no longer beginning from the victimized or split subject of representation, the barred subject or whatever, but rather from the, now that I see Julie's beautiful face, I'll call it the tragically triumphant subject of enjoyment, the parler-être. It's a movement from suffering to trauma. And I make a distinction then. The split subject suffers, but the parler-être is traumatized. It's worse. And it's why I'm so happy you're on camera, Julie, because now you're making me think of a whole bunch of things. It's why I found that a vase is a much more interesting object than a coffee cup. Sorry, I have a different coffee cup today. There's something remarkable about the practice of placing, yours is, see, Jonas, I don't see a hole there. Yours is a vase. There's something quite, oh, you do, okay. There's something quite remarkable about the practice of placing dead flowers into a vase. It's beautiful. I'm drawn to it. And I was thinking maybe every psychoanalyst should have dead flowers in a vase placed onto the bookshelves or the countertops in their consulting rooms to remind them of this important point. For every consulting room, just as for every home, a vase. Why? Remember, a vase is not a coffee cup. And it really makes a difference that a vase is not a coffee cup. When the subject is not split, then it means that there's no home for that subject as a speaking being in the world. It doesn't mean that it can't be without a home, that it cannot be without a home, since not being without a home is different from being homeless, as well as having a home. Those are different positions. Having a home, being homeless, and not being without a home. Those are three different positions. Julie reminded us last week that I might get it wrong. You can correct me maybe after, Julie, if I get it wrong. If I heard you correctly, it was brilliant. I haven't stopped thinking about it, and I've been trying to talk to Julie about it while we're walking and stuff because it's been tormenting me a bit, this new position. She reminded us, if I remember correctly, that the unheimlich, the unheimlich, variously translated as the uncanny or the unhomely for Freud, but also for Heidegger. It's basically a topological device. And she said, I mean, it's in my own words because I'm trapped in my world here, but what I heard, which doesn't mean that I heard her, but I tried. What I thought I heard was that a vase is like a home. And it's brilliant. It's why I could claim that Julie's a vase to me. Anyway, in this commentary, she reminded us that a home has holes. She likened the vase and the coffee mug and what we were talking about to the home, to the unheimlich, to the house, the dwelling space of language and speech and so on. And I find it interesting because today there's more vases than homes in the world, thanks to capitalism. But from the standpoint of topology, a vase does not have a hole, H-O-L-E. It's why a vase is closer to the, how do you call it? The Buenaventura Hotel. You know it, the Buenaventura Hotel, famous landmark in California, because Frederick Jameson wrote about it in his essay on postmodernism as an example of postmodern architecture. You should look it up. It's great what he says about it. But it's why I think the vase is closer to the Buenaventura Hotel than it is to a home in of itself. Jameson was describing postmodern ideology. Anyway, with the Buenaventura Hotel, like a vase, you don't know if it's possible to enter the space or even to leave the space. You don't know where you go in to the hotel and how to get out. It's a labyrinth, it's a maze. Where's the inside? Where's the outside? It's the distinction trace, like, can you even trace this distinction at the level of its structure is the question. It's fascinating to me because, we're told that postmodern architecture is produced in such a way that, Frederick Jameson says this, that it reflects the world back. It reflects the world back. If you look at photos of the Buenaventura Hotel in California, that one, I think there's others, you'll see that it's sheets of glass. It reflects the world. It wants nothing to do with the world. So finally, there's only the world, which overtakes the hotel. So there's only world. I can imagine that the Buenaventura Hotel disappears into the world, just like Antigone disappeared into the world. That's why ultimately, it's a piece of melancholic architecture. And anyway, if you play with the surface of a vase, if you play with it, melting it down, while retaining any of the through holes that are there, the holes, it becomes reducible to a disk. to a sphere, a ball of clay without holes. It becomes a ball, a surface without a hole, one, it becomes one. It's not like a coffee cup, because there's a little space for your finger here on the side. This isn't a hole at the top, topologically speaking. This is a hole on the side, though. You melt it down, you fold the surface, you end up with a donut, a torus, with a hole in the middle. So that's the difference between a vase and a coffee cup. Vase, no hole. Coffee cup, a hole. It's also a difference between, on the one hand, my childhood home, which has a front door. If you go through the front door, you can keep going. It'll bring you right to the back door, and you can go back out again without any obstructions. And also the human body, which Julie and I learned after watching a video last week or 2 weeks ago, that maybe there's only one real hole in the human body. It's debatable. But the Buenaventura Hotel, it's not clear it has a hole, topologically speaking. Anyway, I apologize for the tangent. I know it's a big tangent. I have something else to say about melancholic architecture, though, before I get back to what I wanted to say, because I was thinking also just now that while I was working in Russia, while we were working in Russia, Julie and I were working in Russia, I was a professor at the School of Advanced Studies, University of Tumen, and I remember having dreams about being trapped inside of the campus building. Okay, I'm sure it wasn't a dream. In fact, it's a nightmare. Which means precisely that I wasn't dreaming. That's what a nightmare is. Most of the people who worked there, from what I could tell, felt the same way. We talked privately about how we would wake up in the middle of the night and check our phones, check our messengers, check our emails to make sure that we didn't miss some sort of a message or request from the institution. So it was a nightmare. The building there was designed in such a way that you never felt outside of it, even when you were in fact outside of it. And yet, upon trying to enter it, it's as if you're endlessly reflected outside. Like, you're not wanted in this building, in this fucking school. They don't even want to hire you. But yet, once you're in, you can't leave the fucking place. You know, like, just to get inside the building, for example, they subject the workers to these grueling initiations, hazing rituals that they call project design sessions. They're just a long process of trying to get inside. Even when we left after we're trying to leave Russia because of the war and so on, the building, and in some sense the people, kept following us along everywhere we went, like a bad nightmare, taunting us, or me, I should say. I don't want to speak for Julie. Taunting me, provoking my family on social media, and so on. Anyway, I learned, that's a huge tangent, apologies. I learned that the building was designed based off of another building in Moscow City, an infamous building on Skolkovo campus. Skolkovo has a history. It's a building called the Hypercube. Now, if any of you are Canadian, you already know something of the Hypercube because, first off, it was designed by the same architect, as far as I know, the building at the School of Advanced Studies and the building in Moscow. But the word Hypercube, it's the name of a film franchise, a really popular film franchise by a Canadian, I think it's a Canadian filmmaker, I'm sure it is. And the film is about the horror of getting outside of the cube once you're found mysteriously inside of it. Mysteriously. You can't seem to find a way out. What's fascinating to me is that the students at the university I just mentioned even gave, on more than one occasion, really wonderful presentations showcasing the similarities between their campus, the School of Advanced Studies, and the Hypercube film. Another point, just a final tangent, is that what fascinated me about the film was that one of the ways, perhaps the only way to get out of the film, is to break through the verbosity of knowledge in order to arrive at some hard kernel of the real, which is what Lacan called the letter. They had to use mathematics and formulae to get out. So it's a point of convergence between the real and the symbolic, a pact, something like a quilting point against the terror of not having an inside and an outside. Anyway, that's a point we can explore another time. The point today is simply that when there's no whole, you experience the world as if it were a vase rather than a torus. And when you live in that sort of nightmare, you might have a vase, but it doesn't mean you have a home. As I see it, one of the fundamental problems of the West, it really began several decades ago. It roughly corresponds with a transitional moment in the Western social history. It's a moment of radical homelessness, a housing crisis. But there's even a dimension of radical homelessness at play in Freud's essay on the Unheimlich. The Unheimlich is a housing crisis. It seems to me, if you read his essay on the uncanny, that the double, what he calls the double, it appears precisely there to signal that something in the real is emerging that was foreclosed in the symbolic. I'll explain what it means as we move on, but like the eyes of the dolls, for example, they feel threatening to children, castrating even. The Sandman delusions, gonna come and take out your eyes, like Oedipus and so on. They all occur when the signifier doesn't castrate, but the real does. So there's more than enough vases in the world today. I'm reminded also suddenly that you can find some vases inside of it's Ramadan Mubarak. You can find some vases inside of the Kaaba in Mecca, God's home, giving the impression that the congregations there are circumambulating, not around the house, but around the vase, in the revolutions around the vases. The vases are nested inside of the Kaaba, that God's house, and the revolutions there keep you spinning, returning always to the same place. The nightmare is a disc. It's the navel of our dream house, of our dwelling spaces, and it goes on and on and on. You wake up only to find yourself repeating the nightmare again and again and again. And I would say that it's only by permitting yourself to be a dupe, by believing in the semblant, what we talked about last week, the semblant, or what Max Stirner called a spook. It's only in believing in it, being stupid enough to believe in a spook or a semblant, that you're capable of producing a whole in jouissance. Otherwise, the whole turns on the symbolic. If it's not there on the real, it turns on the symbolic, such that a whole occurs on the very space that would have housed the signifier. In which case, you wouldn't have a home with holes, you'd have a hole in place of a home. So it's a vase without a home. What I called last week, and I gave it the dignity of a title for the lecture, the revolutions of the one, which involve repetitions not at all in the world. These are revolutions that occur without a home. So the key question is, how can you speak in a housing crisis? Anarchists might propose, we often do. I know when the war broke out against Ukraine, a lot of anarchists, myself included, were celebrating the fact that some anarchists were squatting at oligarchs' home, for example. So maybe you might propose squatting the homes of oligarchs and masters, but it's not going to solve the problem. I'm in sympathy for this solution, but it doesn't go far enough. You only move into the space of mastery, demonstrating, at least for a short period of time, that you can pretend to be the king of the castle. I begin from a different perspective, which is the presumption that we all have some homelessness within ourselves. And even some homelessness is too much. Even a king who believes that he has a castle is actually homeless. And last week I said something that made a few of you uncomfortable. I could tell, by the way, I'm not necessarily concerned by it, although I would have been maybe a year ago, because I can't be canceled anymore. Russia, I kind of take this expression from Julie, who always has these brilliant expressions. Russia already canceled me, you know? So I'm not necessarily concerned anymore. Julie's point, I think, in her interview a few weeks ago was that Russia's been trying to cancel Ukraine. But I've already been canceled. It's why I'm giving this lecture from the bedroom of a home that's not my own. This isn't my house. I'm in a period of homelessness. But I'm not without a home. And that's the difference. I do have access to this bedroom. I have access to the home, which provides me with certain luxuries despite the circumstances. Anyway, the uncomfortable claim that I made was that we moved from the all world, the world of the all as a totalizing principle, the world of the all, to the not all world, the world of the not all, which are two different governing principles. So it's a shift into a feminine world. It's not exactly good news. It means, for example, that our social movements have become like bubbles, disjointed from the world. It's why it's necessary, finally, to speak of these social movements, of anarchist social movements, perhaps, or what I hesitate to call the newest social movements. Lacan had a name for these newest social movements, fraternities. That was a concept for him, fraternities. And a few weeks ago, I gave a lecture to a different audience where I tried to convince some people of a point. I don't think anybody really thought it was that clever. I thought it was clever, but what do I know? I tried to convince people that Althusser's logic of ideological interpolation was actually a way of fraternizing with the police officers. Rather than, it wasn't subjection to a symbolic master splitting the subject, he formed a fraternity with the police officer. And it helped me to explain Althusser's melancholia. Anyway, you can go back and try and find that lecture somewhere on the internet. Lacan was, in fact, a bit of a sociologist, and perhaps he was more of a sociologist than sociologists are themselves. And he was even a scholar of the newest social movements. What he named fraternities, it's a group orientation. It's an orientation of the group. Psychoanalysts have always been suspicious of groups, but it doesn't mean we're incapable of working alongside one another, even if it proves difficult. But the group is also a subject. You can take the group as a subject or a bubble. Psychoanalysts have a different orientation to the group, and it's a position that's actually quite close to Max Stirner's position, his union of egoists, if you know it. But it's not reducible to Stirner's position. It goes further. It's also close to the anarchist logic of the affinity group. Except Lacan called his affinity group a cartel. There are clear differences between an affinity group and a cartel. The cartel does not pretend to eradicate the place of power, and yet it does. It affects a separation of knowledge and power, separating them. And we can see it clearly in the function of what's called the plus one. The plus one. In a psychoanalytic cartel, there's a function known as the plus one. The plus one is, some people might think it's the leader of the cartel or something. That's not what it is. The plus one is not the person who represents the group, who represents the cartelicians, the members of the group, of the affinity group, if you like. It's not a place of representation, the plus one. It's also not a place of knowledge. It's quite the opposite. The plus one of the psychoanalytic cartel is a place of hystericization. a place that functions to disrupt the group effects that lead us toward either hierarchy or fraternity. It disrupts the tendency toward hierarchy and fraternity. That's how I read the Cartel as a group. The Cartel, which is an organ of the psychoanalytic school, is capable of producing what anarchists have never been capable of producing. A group that's radically anti-authoritarian, anti-representation, but also anti-fraternity. And yet, for all of that, without killing the world or the space that would house the loneliness of each one of us. The Cartel is an answer to the question, how can we live with the consequences of our revolutionary impulses? Without, in that process, producing a device that would bury the subject in his or her own revolutionary impulses. There's a lot more I'd love to say there, but I think I need to keep going. There's something more to say about the newest social movements, which are not at all the same as these psychoanalytic groups. I've named these newest social movements, these fraternities, I've called them singularities. I use the phrase imprecisely. So I'm not using the concept of singularity the way psychoanalysts use it, for example. But I think we can trace a history of the emergence of singularities in the Western world. And many have done so. Many have done it in their own way, and according to their own assessment of the consequences. Most have claimed that the transition began in the last part of the 1960s or in the early 1970s. Slavoj Žižek, taking his bearings from Lacan, the early middle period of Lacan, described the transition as being characterized by a decline of symbolic efficiency. Justin, I'll get to your point. Thank you. I just saw it. I will get to your point. The decline of symbolic efficiency. It means that the function of the name of the father, the nom de père, the master signifier as a master signifier, it weakened. It's no longer taken as the linchpin of Western social bonds. And there's been an assortment of names to describe this new logic, proving that there are many names of the father. Post-patriarchal, neoliberal, postmodern capitalist, liquid modernity, risk society, the society of the spectacle, on and on and on, prosumer capitalism, on and on and on and on and on, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on, etc. Plus. Each position constructs a narrative for itself concerning the mortification, the killing of the master signifier as the linchpin of the social bond. In other words, these narratives concern the mortification of the very place of power, which is the signifier. And the traditional way of thinking about it was to claim that a master signifier, it would have prohibited jouissance, enjoyment. Jouissance is better. It would have prohibited it, which means that it would have negated jouissance. It would have introduced a negation. The signifier is a negative thing. And Lacanians discovered on this point that there was always this little bit of surplus jouissance, this residue of positive jouissance that could not be negated, that goes on repetitively. So finally, not all of it would have been negated, not all. So we can say that jouissance is therefore the source of toxic positivity, of our toxic positivity. There's a positivity to jouissance because its root, or I would say at its root, it refuses to be relinquished, to be negated. The subject, by accepting the prohibition upon its jouissance, or enjoyment if you like, it would have emerged split in the world, victimized by the signifier, from within the totality of its social relations, split from its cause, from jouissance. So for example, the subject would have been split off from other workers, from other women, and so on and so on and so on and so on. This was even the foundation upon which the earlier Marxist criticism aimed, particularly before the economic and philosophical manuscripts. the subject was thought to be split from the totality of its symbolic relationships. Like in the discussion of the 4 forms of alienation, for example. You're split from other workers and so on. So, in a word, the subject was represented by one signifier for another signifier. And this was the price of admission into the Western social order. Freud named neurosis, what Freud called neurosis, was that condition resulting from not being capable of living with those consequences, from not accepting the prior mortification of jouissance. Neurosis is the inability to live with the consequences of the part that was not at all made for civilization. Maybe what Rancière calls the part of non-part or whatever. So neurotics suffered because they cannot live with the consequences of having already paid the price. So they went to psychoanalysts to find reprieve of their symptoms. However, singularities have not paid the price from the very beginning, and therefore have no need of psychoanalysts. They're not in search of any surprises because they've already too much. But it doesn't stop, so they've not paid the price from the beginning, the price of castration, but it hasn't stopped them, singularities, from forming groups, fraternizing with one another. And what some anarchists have referred to, getting to your point, take me a minute to develop it in the chat, a point that was made in the chat, what some anarchists have referred to as the newest social movements. Some, I'm one of them, I wrote about them as well. They are precisely these singularities, bubbles without castration. The revolutionary aspirations of modern anarchism have led to a proliferation of relatively autonomous social movements whose confrontation with the master became increasingly postponed, or at the extreme, completely abandoned. Raymond Williams would have called that the long revolution. It is long. All revolutions are the long revolution. When you begin from the position of the slave's aspirations, because the slave postpones a confrontation with the master in Hegel or Kojève's discussion of the master-slave, the slave postpones a confrontation with the master out of fear of death. That's his certainty. The slave postpones it. And that's when the long revolution begins from the standpoint of the slave's revolutionary aspirations. He begins the long work of trying to overthrow the master. Autonomous social movements demonstrate a problem that exists beyond political representation and the long revolution. And the problem is jouissance. The key problem of singularities is not, how can we live without a master, or how can we get rid of the master or transgress or go beyond the laws of the world and so, but it's how can we live within the mystery. And in his ethics seminar, Lacan reminded us that the thing, das Ding in this case, but it can be die Sache, I don't know how to say it in German, S-A-C-H-E, another variation on the word thing in German. Stirner tends to use the latter. Lacan reminded us that the thing, the cause, it's the real secret. He said it plainly, das Ding is the real secret. When you make the thing your own cause, as Stirner did, when you make the cause your own, you become the secret, the enigma, the mystery. But how can you live with the unbearable mystery of jouissance? A Canadian professor named Richard J.F. Day, I have no trouble naming him, he's a friend of mine. He wrote an incredible book titled Gramsci is Dead many years ago. Yes, thank you. This book changed it all for me. Before I discovered clinical psychoanalysis, it rescued me, that book. I left my hometown I traveled to the other side of Canada to study with Richard, who was my supervisor. He really helped me with some things I was going through. His work showcases attempts to live beyond revolutionary aspirations. What he named the logic of hegemony is, in our language, the world of the all, totality. For him, it's a logic whose political tendencies are oriented by either reform or revolution. These twin tendencies, for him, are traps because they remain within the totalizing principle, the all. It's clear to me that his book discovered a secret: how to locate the spaces of the not all. But he didn't offer a way to sustain those spaces, I don't think. How do you sustain it? I can imagine that these are resolutely melancholic communities, spaces of suicidal ideation. His claim, really simply, was that anarchists discovered an alternative political logic that's not at all trapped within the logic of hegemony. And what was his logic? It was a logic beyond the determinations of the world of mastery. It's a logic of autonomy. I didn't say autonomy, but autonomy, or singularity. Those are the words he used, and it surprised me. I didn't know it when I started this lecture series 2 weeks ago. I didn't know he used the word singularity in that book. I knew he used the word autonomy and that he draws a lot from Marxist Italian autonomous movements and so on and ideas. But his idea was that the future world, it's the idea of many anarchists, it could be experienced today, here and now. And it was also the position of some of the more peripheral anarchists who I very much admire, including Gustav Landauer, Hakim Bey, and so on. But it's a call to experience the future today and to, in Richard's words, Justin, render redundant. I love this expression, to render redundant the world of mastery. You render it redundant. So you're rendering redundant the world. I never quite understood until today, actually, what he meant by render redundant, which he used repetitively in that book. Justin, if you go flip through it, I'm sure you know it better than I do. He uses this expression a lot, and it was always obscure to me, even when I wrote a book on this book. I defended a dissertation on this book and the ideas that came out of it. I never understood what this expression really meant. I had an intuition, but never got it, until I saw the Buenaventura Hotel. It's as if the world of mastery would defeat itself if only you allowed it to go on living without you, to go on rambling without you. It's an uncoupling of oneself from the world, the displacement of the subject from the world into an autonomous zone, the ones all alone. And these singular communities are described by him as becoming communities in the plural. Giorgio Agamben's expression, but he didn't put it in the plural. How are these ones all alone organized? He used the anarchist and autonomous Marxist language of affinity, network logic, and voluntary association. This latter phrase, voluntary association, has been really important for some anarchists I've noticed, particularly those in the Western world, particularly those in the American continent, but also some in the United Kingdom I've noticed. It was also an important concept for Benjamin Tucker, prominent American anarchist, and Emma Goldman, and who knows how many other more foundational anarchists from the so-called classical tradition. They insisted upon principles of voluntary associations, voluntary social bonds formed of one's own free motivation, aspiration, we might say. It's different from the alienated social bonds described so well by Karl Marx, where you're forced into social bonds at the workplace, but not of your own choosing. It seems to presume then a social bond entirely independent of the world of mastery. So, okay, maybe it's not. Either it's a goal to be achieved, voluntary association, an aspiration, or else we have to presume that it can be achieved here and now, spontaneously. There's got to be one of those two. It raises some problems. If we can't have a voluntary association until we're prepared for it, maybe spiritually or ethically or whatever, until we're capable of forming fair and equal bonds with one another without the various strata of mastery or ideology or whatever, then it's a revolutionary aspiration. But if you think you can begin in the here and now with voluntary associations, then you must presume that there are no systems of mastery already in place. Okay, take, for example, a related psychoanalytic concept. Voluntary association in psychoanalysis, let's call it free association. The free choice to form a bond with one's analyst, for example. Well, one of the golden rules of psychoanalysis was free association. You're told by your psychoanalyst to speak freely in your analytic work with your analyst. But then after months or decades, you begin to recognize that you had certain unconscious presuppositions. Althusser would call that ideology, maybe, that was actually motivating all of your free speech all of that time, and you hadn't interrogated reflexively, you hadn't interrogated it yet or whatever. So when you do, you move into what Lacan calls full speech. You become surprised by your speech, you realize that you're determined by these things. In the final instance, it's an aspiration. It's based upon free association, which, like free speech, is governed by the contours of your linguistic world. It's why I maintain that revolutionary impulses are neither reducible to aspirations toward the future, nor are they merely in the here and now. They come to us from the future. The revolutionary impulses, they come to us from the future. They're not in the here and now. The aspirations are directed toward the future. The impulses come to us from the future. Melancholia is a view from the future. It's futurist. I gave a lecture on this also a few weeks ago. I'm not going to repeat all the reasoning, but I'll just add that revolutionary aspirations are a view toward an impossible future. Anyway, I'm going to return to my thread. Autonomous organizations are meant to exist outside of the logic of totality, outside of the all, the world, and hence it's a view from the future. Anarchists pride themselves often on suggesting that they have at least one foot in the future. They prefigure the future that they would like to see here and now. Prefigurative politics has been a bit of a buzzword in anarchist social spaces for maybe 15, 20 years or something. What's surprising to me also is that Richard J.F. Day described his autonomous logic as being a revolutionary impulse. It's just a coincidence. I didn't know that he was saying, but it's a convenient coincidence. I'll share a quote from his book, quote, "The radical impulse of post-1968 French theory was the impulse to create alternatives to the state and corporate forms, rather than just work within them. So it's not a call to go outside, but it's a call from the outside. And it's for this reason that I claim that autonomy is the work of radical homelessness. How can the autonomous movement grow in influence, if not without finding a means to not be without a world? To write a book or enter a lecture hall to remind everybody that they must go outside, for example. It's only during moments of particular lucidity that these alternatives presume themselves to be independent of the world of mastery. The problem, as I see it, and I'll try and develop it maybe, is that the contemporary world is also increasingly independent of the world of mastery. A contentious point, I know. But it doesn't mean that that world is inhabitable. It also means, if I'm saying that our world is outside of the world of mastery, it sounds like a sick joke, I know. But it doesn't mean that fascism and tyranny don't exist, they do. And it doesn't mean that we don't have within our midst dangerous new forms of radical authoritarianism across all corners of the globe, because we do. It just means that they function according to a different logic, a more singular and hence more cunning logic. To provoke you, I'll claim that it's the logic of autonomy. It's become the dominant principle of our world. Lacan warned us about this when he spoke about the rise of fraternities, which are societies of brothers, comrades, as he put it. They come after the weakening of the paternal metaphor, the weakening of the organizational capacity of the name of the father, the nom de père, the rise of the logic of autonomy, voluntary association, which is characteristic of the newest social movements. It can quite accurately be described as being predicated upon a more primordial logic of segregation. Segregation. You know, I remember it quite clearly when I went to Queen's University, study with Richard. And I organized with the revolutionary anarchist students at the university there. These were fraternal activities with hazing rituals and everything. I had to spray paint the wall on campus to show that I was like truly committed to get inside the group and so on. They were fraternal activities. The principle of voluntary association was taken very seriously by the anarchist bear at that time. And it was used precisely as a means of segregation from the world ultimately, but also from me. And it hurt to be segregated from, to have somebody not want to voluntarily associate with you. I even remember pointing out to them that it seemed to me to be an easy way to justify segregating from people of color. I mean, I was quite moronic at the time. So I said, like, okay, according to this logic, what stops you from voluntarily associating only with men or only with white people? Implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly excluding women, implicitly excluding some other part that's not being mentioned, whatever it could be. Because the old prohibitions explicitly excluded Jews, for example, communists, homosexuals, Freemasons, gypsies, and so on. You know, that was the principle of fascism. It was an explicit prohibition. What we're witnessing here is an implicit, through a logic of segregation, through a particular affirmation. You affirm, you voluntarily associate through your own free will. So you could say simply, it's voluntary association, it's freedom. I'm not excluding anybody, I'm just freely choosing who to include. It's rapidly becoming the principle of power for nations all around the world. And if I had more time, because there's a lot I want to say, I could give you concrete examples. I've given them in numerous other publications, so just go look for it when I talk about the Citizens Amendment Act in India, for example, as the clearest case of this. It's functioning at the level of the state, at the level of policy. It's not an anarchist logic. Okay, racism does have a very particular meaning, but for Lacan, it took on the characteristic logic of our time. We can call it Lacanian racism, or Eric Laurent called it racism 2.0. It's not reverse racism. That's not what we're talking about. It's not reverse. It's a completely different logic than what some people call reverse racism. It's a logic of segregation that inevitably occurs among singularities. When they spit out antagonisms, castration, when they spit out ruptures, fissures, constitutive lack, and so on, so that nothing is lacking from within the group, there's a segregation from the world. The singularity segregates itself from the world and from other singularities whose jouissance is insulting and traumatizing to them. When castration is not accepted, when foreclosure is generalized, to bring it back to what I was talking about last week, the split that would have animated the internal relations of the group and made it difficult for them, hence producing aspirations to make it better, it gets rejected. That split gets rejected. It returns with a vengeance from without, from outside the singularity. If it's not accepted inside, it goes outside, in the real. Suddenly, because castration shifts from the symbolic into the real, you experience the world as a truly threatening place. The signifier no longer represents the group, it triggers the group. And this was Lacan's early definition of foreclosure, taken from his third seminar. What gets rejected from the symbolic, namely castration, it returns in the real. It comes from Freud's discussion of psychosis. What's rejected returns from without. That's how Freud put it. What's rejected returns without. So what's outside the singularity becomes quite precisely a potential source of trauma or insult for everything inside the singularity. I am insulted by the world, I get it. But this is what the principle of fraternity entails. I'll quote Lacan. Fraternity is founded on segregation. No fraternity is conceivable, has even the slightest foundation, except through the fact that people are isolated together, isolated from the rest. It's why today, by the way, I had lined up to show a clip from The Master, the film The Master, which I really encourage you to watch. There's a scene between Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman where Philip Seymour Hoffman is saying, you think you can live without a master? Go ahead. And then once you figure it out, let the rest of us know, because you'll be the first in the history to have done so. Well, this is what we're trying to work at. We could have said also isolated from the world. The quotation I just gave you comes from the later period of Lacan, but it's already there in the third seminar, where there was an interest in the concept of fraternity in the early Lacan. He already pointed at the logic of fraternity among the psychotic figure of Schreber, who's the most cited psychotic in the Freudian field. Schreber's earliest manifestation of psychosis was melancholic psychosis. Lacan focused on Schreber's soul murder, and he cites what Schreber calls a soul fragment, which might have later been referred to as a semblant for Lacan. Or you can call it, if you want to use Stirner's words, a spook or a fixed idea or something. The semblant was established by Schreber by way of a fraternity when he was a melancholic, a fraternity named the Brothers of Cassiopeia. I'm going to quote a long passage from Lacan because I was struck when I found this the other day. Quote, a soul fragment thus ties itself on somewhere. A soul fragment thus ties itself on somewhere. Cassiopeia, the Brothers of Cassiopeia, which is a real fraternity, play a major role here. It's the name of a student confederation from the time of Schreber's studies. An attachment to such a fraternity, whose narcissistic, even homosexual character is brought out in the analysis, is moreover a characteristic mark of Schreber's imaginary antecedents. It is suggestive to see how this network, which is symbolic by nature and maintains the image in a degree of stability in interhuman relationships, is necessary so that everything doesn't suddenly reduce to nothing, so that the entire veil of the imaginary relation does not suddenly draw back and disappear in the yawning blackness that Schreber was not so very far away from at the outset, I think is what he meant. To me, this passage is striking. It goes to show you also, by the way, that the future teachings of Lacan find their way of producing their little effects in the past teaching of Lacan. The future really does prefigure the past. So just to be really straightforward, we used to doubt our knowledge. We used to doubt what we thought we knew. And then we supposed that there were experts out there. Experts like doctors, police officers, judges, presidents, professors, psychoanalysts, whoever. Today, there's a general incredulity toward meta-narratives. That's how Lyotard put it, incredulity toward meta-narratives. It means that there's an intense suspicion of the world of mastery and of the knowledge generated by constituents of that world. Singularities do not overthrow that world. They find themselves uncoupled from it. And it produces the paradoxical result of an ever more cruel, disgusting, and insulting world. So the problem just shifts into a different register. For example, we've not become post-patriarchal, to the great dismay of Jordan Peterson and some others who seem to suggest that we're post-patriarchal or something. We haven't become post-patriarchal today. We've displaced the symbolic patriarchy into a real patriarchy. What we have today is something worse than patriarchy. It's real patriarchy. We got out of patriarchy only to experience it in a much more devastating way. Moreover, we haven't actually conquered our doubts. We've merely replaced them with certainties and discovered that it's the world that doubts us. So it's a fundamental change. Today, more than ever, the voices that are foregrounded in political and social commentary and the newest social movements tend to begin with presuppositions regarding their singular group. And I think it belies a fear of falling into the depths of uncertainty, of losing the space within which they're capable of speaking, we are capable of speaking. The problem is that the world doubts our presuppositions, our certainties. Hence, the world becomes threatening to the integrity of the singularity. So we attempt to defend at all costs the certainty of a semblant that sustains the consistency of and the internal consistency of our fraternal group, and that threatens to take away the space of our speech, leaving us essentially destitute, homeless. Hence, the stubbornness of today's newest social movements testifies more generally to the cancellation of the dwelling space of language and speech. And it leads us to a problem. The newest social movements, by adopting a tactical political philosophy, cannot seem to escape the pitfalls of the revolution of the one. You know, this expression, tactical political philosophy, I'm now using it because I presume it might resonate for one of you, but I'm not sure if it does. But this expression, tactical political philosophy, comes out of the post-anarchist political philosophy of Todd May. I just realized that this bright day in May is turning into a night here in Ireland. Anyway, I'm just going to try and bring what I'm trying to say today to some sort of a conclusion by developing this a little bit and ending with it. Todd May, well, he's against psychoanalysis, to be clear. And he's against the Lacanian tradition. You know, he sees it as being too focused on the individual rather than the collective, which you know, the collective, I would say, amounts to a fraternity. But the problem is quite the opposite. The fraternity leaves no space for the subject. The individual is not a subject. It's the fraternity that's individual. The fraternity is individual. Individual, without division. May famously distinguished between three types of political philosophies, what he called formal, strategic, and tactical political philosophies, these three. And according to him, let's go through them maybe one at a time. Formal political philosophy cleaves stubbornly to either what is, which is a certain type of political realism, what actually is, or else what should be. It chooses one of those two poles at the expense of occupying the tension between those two poles. That's how he puts it. So for him, it's a stubborn position, formal political philosophy, because it refuses this tension between what is and what ought to be. And therefore, it refuses the tension between what is real and what could be, or something like that. That's how he puts it. I don't particularly agree with that language, but I'm trying to understand what he's saying. So you can, for example, focus on preserving the political order as it currently is. We might call that a conservative position, maybe, without concerning yourself at all with what ought to be. Or perhaps you can go the other way, and you could be out in the clouds, out in the stars or whatever, concerning yourself only with what ought to exist, what ought to be, what should exist, without recognizing that you have to ground that somehow in the practical world, in what is. So both are problems, and it's a pitfall of formal political philosophy, according to Todd May. Strategic political philosophy kind of gets out of this trap, but only by, for May, only by introducing a new trap. It seems to be an advancement because there's a concern with the tension between what is and what ought to be, but it nonetheless remains tethered to what he calls, I believe I'm quoting him, a unitary, I love that expression, unitary, because it has resonance in the Lacanian tradition, but unitary analysis of power. Strategic philosophy tethered to a unitary analysis of power, which means it takes power as a unitary phenomenon. It's a unit. So there's a concern with what Saul Newman, another post-anarchist who I agree the most with, what he refers to as the place of power. When you're adopting a unitary analysis of power, you presume there's a place of power and you can point at it. It's like an object out there. And it's a central idea in modern and even classical revolutionary political philosophy that there is something like a unitary place of power, and that the abolition of this unitary place of power, it will produce an effective liberation. We can all hold hands, a global fraternity, sing Kumbaya, and we're all fucking peachy. So the revolution is against the place of power. You overthrow the place of power, and therefore it implies that you can live in the great totality of signifying relations, workers join hands with workers, and so on. So strategic political philosophy has a central agenda, and that central agenda orients all of the political aspirations. It's the unit, the place of power is the unit, the object, or what we could call a master signifier. Or signifier one, whatever, non-dependent, whatever you want to call it. But the problem is manifold. First, it's clear that the anarchists complicated the Marxist conception of power already. It's a point that Saul Newman once made. He made it very clearly. If it were only about removing the place of power, then we must be presuming something about the real that's hidden from power, that's repressed by power. In other words, we have to have these ontological presuppositions, perhaps humanist, that the real subject is basically good, basically social, basically creative, and all of that is being repressed by the place of power. You remove the place of power, we have it all back again. Okay. The anarchist challenge to Marxism was, at a very early time, it was to suggest that there are multiple registers of power. That's how Todd May puts it. Multiple registers of power, multiple nodes of power, if you like. It means that it's not a unitary analysis, a single master signifier, if you like, since that would imply a centralization of power within the master. Anarchists demonstrated very early that power is not centralized in one location or one object, like the state, the economy, the church, or whatever. There's also patriarchy, there's also racism, the ideological manipulations of the media, of church, and so on. You can keep going. We recognize finally that there are multiple registers of power. And at this point, we're led toward what Todd May called, and he champions it, tactical political philosophy, which is informed for him by what he calls post-structuralism. Love to have a long debate about what post-structuralism means, and anarchism. It's a politics oriented by the multiplicitous registers of power rather than by one central location of power. So what's interesting to me is that it means that there can always be one more place of power in a tactical philosophy, tactical political orientation. And that's what Todd May's challenge leads us to consider. No matter how many places of power are registered, there can always be one more to surprise us. There's always another possible site of capture for the subject. We can call this the plus one, if you want. It's the infinity of registers of power that tactical political philosophy seems to demonstrate. Finally, what we confront is what's beyond the place of power, the real. And it can be discussed in many ways. Like you could say, some people thought they were being really clever when they critiqued Foucault for this. You know, when Foucault was saying power is everywhere, then power is nowhere. But that's precisely what Stirner's point was. The nothing, nowhere, nothing, is a semblant that can hold it all together. It's a last defense against the real. An overlooked point with Todd May's analysis is that he believes that the proliferation of networks of power, their constant reinvention of power in different nodal points, conglomerations of power that can come and go and pop up here and there and so on, it implies that there's an infinitely constituted space of resistance and revolution. The revolution becomes infinite, or as Simon Critchley once put it in a really stupid book, sorry. It's a space where the subject is infinitely demanding. It's his conception of anarchism. Infinite demands to power. In other words, we end up precisely in this really surprising place of the plus one. Power is never where we expect to know it to be. Power is never there where we expect to know it to be. In this conception, power is the surprise package. And from the future possibilities of power, there's an endless resistance, an endless possible revolution. Power continuously changes. It's domineering in certain registers and then receding, inventing new unforeseen registers and so on. Saul Newman even recognized this once briefly toward the end of, I think it was his book From Bakunin to Lacan, when he said that there's this shopping list of oppressions. I love this point, but he didn't develop it at all. A shopping list of oppressions to which we're all, as anarchists, supposed to pay homage to. But there's always a new one that we didn't see coming too. Revolution therefore becomes transformed into the repetition of an encounter with mastery without end. It becomes the revolution of the one. And at this point, I think it's fruitful to adopt a topological approach. The strategic approach is akin to hysterical revolutions, aspirations. But the post-structuralist anarchist approach, it seems to me, it surprises us by discovering a space of singularity and the revolution of the one. It's an approach of singularity because there's no single master. There exists a series, which makes it quite serious, no jokes here. Repetition of encounters with masters, with the signifier, endlessly confronting the signifier. Each one is traumatic, each confrontation. Each one is triggering. I quote Todd May, "For tactical political philosophy, there's no center within which power is to be located. Otherwise put, power, and consequently politics, are irreducible. There are many different sites from which it arises, and there is an interplay among these various sites in the creation of the social world." So it's clear that the movement away from the unitary analysis, which is an analysis of the confrontation with the master signifier, the nom de pair, transforms into a tactical confrontation without the nom de pair, without the master signifier. And at this point, you confront the world as such, never knowing when or where power might launch its next attack. It's a terrible world, a traumatic world. And it's why I caution against the approach which begins from a celebration of the newest social movements, as well as the approaches that have hitherto been classified as formal, strategic, and or tactical political philosophies. We need to invent another position. And that's what psychoanalytic anarchism opens us up into. If post-anarchism is to continue to be relevant today, then it should be taken as a moment of surprise. Post-anarchism was a moment of surprise for anarchism. It's not a post-structuralist position in the final instance. In the final instance, what post-anarchism was a surprise. Post-anarchism must find itself surprised by what anarchism has become, by what we've been saying and doing within our social movements all these years. And it should be prepared to invent an anarchism that is not without a world. And it's that I want to try and finally develop for the last session next week, which will be a lot shorter. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks. If anybody wants to open up a discussion, you're certainly welcome to do so. Julie, thanks.
Thank you for a great lecture. It is really tense, like it's a lot of things, but I wanted to ask, what would you say about the identity politics? How does it play? How can you connect it to the psychoanalytic post-anarchism, and how you can characterize it the way it exists now? Because in relation to the subject, there is it's possible to divide, but at the same time, the community that is not possible to divide. Can we call this identity politics, this community, and is it problematic in this way?
What an incredible question. I don't know, but I'll say a few things. Who knows? I'm not willing to adopt. I don't know if any of you know who Aragorn Bang was. He was a good friend, and he led me many years ago, before it was cool, I guess I'm talking like a hipster, to be very critical of identity politics. But I'm not willing to completely dismiss identity politics. I think identity, on the one hand, we have to be careful because there are some who feel that an identity is like a fixed idea. Stirner would have been against identities. Yes, that's him, Justin. Yeah. Stirner I think would have been against identity as such, but that's why he's a moron. Again, I say that with respect because last week I developed the trinity of idiot, moron, and stupid person. I consider myself stupid. I think Stirner was a moron. And morons certainly are well beyond the idiots. So I think that Stirner would have radically resisted the concept of identity without realizing that the concept of nothing, in a sense, is a last-ditch identity, is a last identitarian defense against the real for him. I think what we have today maybe are something like a few different tendencies. On the one hand, identity was something that tore us as subjects. Like we didn't feel at home in our identities. For a long time, that was kind of the critique. You know, like the old idea of queer theory with Judith Butler was, of course, you know, it's the hysterical question, why am I the identity that the restroom door says I am? And so identity became a sort of a supposition of knowledge that we would doubt. And the doubting was, in some sense, a queering of identity. In this world, we can talk about subjects who are split, and identity was, in some sense, a splitting of the subject. On the other hand, I think increasingly what we witness are tendencies toward a fusion of the subject and the identity, where the identity is taken as an individual, and it's conflated with the notion of subject. And which isn't to say that we should resist that tendency. I don't think we should. It just happens to be an orientation that some people have. But it's a fraternal orientation. I think one can fraternize with an identity, around an identity, and it's precisely a way for people to form social groups. I would call that type of identity, the root of identity is one. It means you're one. So whereas before we felt split by the one, signifier one, master's discourse for Lacan, today I think in some sense for a lot of people, the foremost voices that we hear are those who are par lettre, which means at the level of the one. So that leaves the question of what it means for the next position, the psychoanalytic anarchist position, if you like. And I don't yet have an answer to that, but I would say that I had a dream that answered it for me. You remember the dream, Julie? I had this nightmare dream where I'll just give you a fragment of it. I looked at a table in what I thought was my home, but it wasn't. And there was like a bunch of ID cards there. And I looked and I realized that it wasn't, the ID wasn't me. And a friend of mine realized that the way I was saying ID sounded like ideas. I am not my ideas. I am not my semblance. I am not my identities. And after that, what woke me up and shook me to my core was the truth. And the truth will shake you to your core unless you make peace with it. I looked in the mirror and I saw I was a woman. And it shook me so much, it woke me up. There are some people who have the truth today, the hysterics truth, and have made peace with it, comfort with it. And there are others for whom it is still shocking. And I think that I would say they're just different modalities on identity, the one of identity. And you know, one of the great things about the clinic is that you can kind of take these things one by one, and you can hear how it works for one person. It might be different for another person. But if I'm going to speak as more of like a psychoanalytic sociologist, I think we're at a position today where increasingly we're not at the domain of subjects who are split. We're at the domain of identity as a fraternal organizing principle. Thanks, Julie. Welcome.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. Well, it's quite complicated. I have to go through it again to better understand the things you mentioned, but my mind was stuck this idea that you mentioned, which you say that fraternity is being not separated, and that I totally can't relate. I feel like that's never the case, or maybe, you know, I see, if you look close enough, you see that actually even in the most organized people who work together, who live together, who, you know, yield a profit together or whatever, it can be applied to very different people and places. But I don't know why you said that. I'm curious because, yeah, I don't see this integrity. Even, yeah, in I don't know. I have a limited view of the world, but in places I saw that, you know, that's never the case. Maybe it might look like, to you it might look like that, but if you are critical and investigating, yeah, you see that is actually not the case. But what do you say about that, I wonder?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think, well, of course, it depends how you make use of the word fraternity. For Lacan, it was a technical concept, and it was taken up as a technical concept by Jacques Lacan, Eric Laurent, Marie-Hélène Bruce, and a number of others that are oriented by the, let's say, the difficulty of organizing or thinking about a social bond in the context of something like a psychoanalytic school or something like that. And so when it's taken up as a technical concept, it appears at a very particular moment in Lacan's teaching for him, maybe not for me, maybe not for you, but it appears at a very particular moment when we're at the end of a seminar titled Or Worse, which was supposed to be the father or worse. Maybe another way to say it is the master or worse, or maybe even another way to say it is the nom de père or worse, the father or worse. And so on the one hand, and you can go back, say, to Lacan's essay, very early essay on the British psychiatry in the war, you get this sense that on the one hand, social groups have a vertical relation. This was Eric Laurent's reading of that text. I just read it yesterday, that's why it's on my mind. You can speak in the way that Freud did of vertical relations in a social group. Vertical relations tend to be what anarchists focus on. Let's say revolutionary aspirations tend to focus on the vertical relations of a group, which are authoritarian, tyrannical, whatever else. Let's say the father gets all the enjoyment, all the father of the primal horde, this sort of stuff. And so fraternity has nothing to do with that dimension. Fraternity has to do with the horizontal relations among the brothers. What happens when the father's dead? And what Lacan says, when you're not examining the vertical relations, but when you're just examining the relations among semblable people who are semblants to one another, is a different type of group effect that can be just as terrible if within the vertical relations one is exploited, alienated, as Marx said, your surplus extracted from, all this sort of stuff that both the anarchists and the Marxists clearly recognized in the modern period. Then when we're talking among the brothers in the fraternal relations, it's what Lacan would have called worse, precisely because of segregation. You're not split from within the group, you're split in the real. You're split from other tribes. You're split in how you choose to enjoy yourself or make use of your enjoyment when compared to how others do. And part of what this logic is when we're talking about segregation is, on the one hand, the refusal to accept our own mode of jouissance for what it is. And so we anchor it to what Elie Raglan would call the semblant of a sure thing. I posted on my wall the other day. I like that expression. A certainty, semblant of a certainty. Or we can go in the other way and be absolutely horrified, disgusted, which is a key signifier of the last 15 years, disgusted, insulted, traumatized, triggered by others' jouissance, the way other people enjoy themselves. And so that's what segregation ultimately is. It's a different thing that we need to think about as anarchists. It can't just be the vertical relations. We have to be wary of organizing ourselves, isolating ourselves from the world, from others who maybe have different ways of enjoying themselves, different manners of being in the world. Like, some people love language, some people don't. Some people like Lacan, some people like Foucault. And you can segregate from one another in the way that some anarchists do. Oh, he's an individualist and she's a collectivist, there's a mutualist, there's an anarcho-capitalist, and a crypto-fascist over there, and a pedophile over there, and an autonomous Marxist over there, and it goes on and on and on. And what you get is a certain type of tribalism. And then you all fall into your little affinity groups and your clubhouses. And this is a serious problem in the anarchist tradition. I can testify to it after 20-something years. It's a really serious problem. You have cliques and clubs of anarchists who autistically fund themselves and their own publications, who organize among themselves and call it mutual aid. These things are real. It's a real problem, and we need to be guarded just as much. I'm rambling, I'm preaching a bit. We need to be guarded just as much from the problems of the segregative effects of fraternities as we are from the exploitative, tyrannical practices of masters. Vulcan, I'm sorry, I talked way too much. Justin, thanks, but I just want to give Vulcan, if it's okay, just for a moment, if there's something else you wanted to add, because I spoke a lot there. It's up to you.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if there is a really clear division of the tyrannical and the horizontal, or so I don't know how it applies to me. These things are kind of one within the other and all this sort of stuff. So I'm still understanding, and my experiential, corpus is, limited to what I know. So I always have to think of that and make sense according to that, and might not be effective because I'm, exposed to something just limited. It's a reflection of my world, and well, it's not anymore, but in the past. So yeah, well, thank you. I will think about it, and maybe in future I have another question. But yeah, I see the separate. I don't know. I see this integrity today more than ever, I would say. But that comes also from critical thinking and developing maybe myself. I'm not sure. Well, Justin, yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Dwayne.
Thanks, Vulcan. That's really clarifying. Justin.
Hi, you hear me? Okay, I mostly speak in French, so if my phrases are a little bit bulky, it's why, okay?
Are you in Montreal?
Yeah, I'm from Quebec.
Oh, cool. You know Kirst Blebedev?
What?
I presume you're in the anarchist tradition over in Montreal, where you have he goes by Kirst Blebedev.
I don't know.
Okay.
We are, as we said, we are in little cliques, so maybe we are 2 cliques apart.
I see. Okay.
I have 3 questions. The first one is you talk about like politics coming from the future in regard to prefigurative politics. Just want to elaborate maybe a little bit on that. To respond a bit about like identity politics and Aragorn precisely, there's a problem I think he tackles in his podcast and some of his writing, because identity politics is linked to his indigenous anarchism, I think. And there's a tension between if you accept identity politics as the states organize it, indigenous people are dead and there's no more indigenous people. So I think there's an interesting tension regard his work. And the first time I heard about you, it was in his podcast, so it's fun to talk about him. And the other is a very boring question. I'm working on Gramsci's Dead by Richard Day for my thesis, my master's thesis, and I was wondering if I can find yours. I'm trying to find it quickly on the internet, but I don't know if I can shoot your email so you can maybe send it to me or find it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I deal with it in 2 books. I have a dissertation on it and also a number of articles. So if you email me,
is it the post-anarchist book, like the after post-anarchism and stuff?
I think there's some in there. Yep.
Okay.
No, it is in there. Yeah.
Okay, I'm good.
If you email me or message me on social media, I'll bundle it all together and send it to you.
Okay, cool, perfect.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Awesome. No, your point about Aragorn is, you're absolutely correct. It slipped my mind. You're absolutely correct. Incidentally, it's just a small thing, but that podcast that you likely heard, he traveled on his motorcycle mysteriously all around the continent and maybe elsewhere to interview some people. I was in Michigan at the time, and he just shows up at the cafe on his motorcycle to interview me, and then he goes off to Canada somewhere to talk to somebody there. And it was like a month or 2 later that he passed away under mysterious circumstances. So it was really a beautiful moment. Aragorn is the reason I remain committed to anarchism for so many reasons, things he's done and said. He pulled me into so many different projects, the anarchistlibrary.org, Anarchist News, Anarchy Magazine, the old IRC, all this stuff. Aragorn was a real gift to anarchism. The question, so your point about identity, you're absolutely correct. I have nothing more to add. You're right. Yeah, you're right. And the other thing was about the future. Yeah.
Yeah, because you talked about in the previous week, you talked about where you didn't really like prefigurative politics that much, or you think it was limited, and now you talk about a bit by introducing a politic from the future rather than looking to the future. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's tough. It's something I developed a logic of melancholy as something that exists in the future in a number of texts, and I developed it using a number of sources, and it's meant a little bit to provoke, because we tend to think of the melancholic as being stuck in this hopeless place, cannot seem to get up and wake up and experience the future, which is the day. But what my claim is that the melancholic is in the future, because on the one hand, it's not a world with symbolic masters. And so in some really simplified sense, in the clinical tradition, we can say that there's something of melancholia at stake at the end of analysis, which is the future of your analysis. And what happens in the future is very interesting, because now you're not subjected to the, let's say, the nom de pair or whatever, but you're retroactively, your future is being used, as Freud would say, après coup or whatever, afterward, to retroactively give a hystery. I say that word because it's supposed to resonate with hysteria, a historical account of one's past. And so what I did was, and I know it's not telling you much about anarchism yet, but who knows what I'll say, I don't know yet. I discovered by reading a bunch of melancholic literature that for some reason, a lot of these texts don't, not all of them, but a lot of them begin in the future. Like in Margaret Atwood's text was one I cited, where in, what was the great Canadian author, Margaret Atwood, where she cited, it's called Death by Landscape, is the name of the text, but it also happens in Oryx and Crake and a number of other places. It begins with this depressed woman who's mature, who's older, and she's looking at something missing in her world. And so she's clearly melancholic. She sees loss everywhere, but can't articulate its source. And then the whole narrative goes back to the past to bring you to the point where you realize that you are always in the future, even in the past. You never had a world to begin with. You never had anything holding your world together. And in some sense, that's the big secret of psychoanalysis. There is no other of the other is the big secret of psychoanalysis, which means there never was a world. And the first time I discovered this was in the world of love. And Julie helped me with this because she really pushed me to develop a course on love when I was in Russia, titled Real Love, based off of a stupid book I wrote. And no, I would say it's not stupid enough. But anyway, it's what I discovered was that with Antigone and Eurydice, I don't know if you know it, but it's, you know, this legend of Eurydice and Antigone. What happened when did I say Antigone? Eurydice and Orpheus. Same thing with Antigone though. With Eurydice and Orpheus, what happens is when Eurydice falls into the underworld, Orpheus had to go there to get her, to convince himself that he had her from the very beginning. And what he learns at the end, when he becomes truly melancholic and truly one with her, when he's sitting under the tree being lonely, he won't connect with any women in the world and so on. What he learns is that he never had her from the very beginning. It was pure loss, not lack, but lack of lack, pure loss, which is what we call the real. And so this is what I discover as the truth also in Althusser. You know, Althusser, he killed his wife, and what happened in his book, Memoirs, what was it called? The Future Lasts Forever. In The Future Lasts Forever, he begins with the narrative of him strangling his wife while he's trying to massage her. And you don't even, like, it's missing the moment where he actually kills her. He doesn't even know when that moment happened. And so the whole book for, like, I don't know how many pages, 400 pages after that, is just him trying to develop a narrative of a history of what had happened there. And so the future bleeds into the past. And what the anarchists do is they're obsessed with the future, but you have to be. The futurists were obsessed with the future too. You have to be obsessed with the future if you want to have a world without masters. A world without masters is the future, but we're not capable of living in the future. We have to live in the past. This is the point I made. We can discover the truth of the future, but we have to live its consequences by historicizing the past. Without a narrative of our past. And so you know, in terms of the practical aspects of what that means for anarchism, it would, you know, it's difficult for me. I'm not exactly sure how to talk about it in terms of anarchism, but one thing I can be sure of is that it was the expression of Gustav Landauer. You know, was it Landauer or was it Bob Black or was it Hakim Bey? One of those three. I'm getting them mixed up right now. But they said, "Are we doomed forever to live in the past, or can we build, no, it was hacking back. Can we build some temporary or permanent autonomous zones here and now and taste some of that future freedom today? Can we have some of it now? Like, do we have to just keep waiting and waiting for the, and I think that in this way, we're both oriented toward the future, but we have to be careful because we can also get the future. And what Lacan's future teachings demonstrate, what his late teaching demonstrates, is not only the truth of his past teachings, but the mystery, but also the horrific consequences of not having a past. I know it's obscure, and I'm sorry. It would take me a bit more time to try and develop it along.
Wait, can you just repeat the Lacan stuff? You just said it. The thing about Lacan. Okay, never mind.
Lacan. Oh,
Yeah.
his future teaching. I think
Yeah.
it bleeds into his past teaching. You know,
Oh,
one of
okay,
the
okay,
things-
okay. I get
One of
it,
the
I get it.
things that I found really interesting about my orientation to Lacan, I don't know how interested you are in Lacan, but when I began, I was obsessed with the early to middle period of Lacan. And then I got fixated on the late Lacan, but I became completely detached from the early and middle period of Lacan. Like I was totally disinterested by early middle period of Lacan. It was all late teaching of Lacan, beginning not even at or worse, but the next seminar after that, I think The Limits of Love and Knowledge Encore. And what's interesting to me is how suddenly, in some new mode this year, I'm finding new ways to read the past stuff. I'm finding that the future Lacan was already there determining all of this stuff that was happening in the early Lacan, but in a really obscure way, in a really enigmatic way. You know, it's not like the early Lacan, the middle Lacan, there's some sort of symbolic truth to be discovered. There's stuff of, there's these enigmatic mysteries in the early Lacan, like, for example, his concept of fraternity, or his concept of foreclosure. You know, what you're dealing with is the stuff that came in the future. And you realize that all this stuff in the past was totally unhinged, but I'm stupid enough to believe in it anyway. I'm stupid enough to read it and to find it interesting again, rather than to remain detached and uncoupled from it. So anyway, I know it's rambling, it's obscure nonsense, and I can't really speak to the concreteness of you know, the what it means for anarchist movements on the ground. Maybe this is all I would say, and it is more obscurity, and then I'll stop. I think today what we're discovering from the newest social movements and what anarchists can really offer the world is to step out of the future. We have too much of the future right now, and it's lasting forever. That was Althusser's expression, the future lasts forever. That was the title of his book. It really did last forever for him. It's an infinite series, the revolution of the one. It perpetuates, it's limitless. And I think that I've had enough of the future for the time being. It doesn't mean I want to go back to some patriarchal golden age of the past, but it means that I want to begin to tell more interesting stories about the past. That's all I can say, I guess. Is it
Thanks
okay?
a lot. Thanks you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and thanks for interesting questions and being here. Is it okay if we stop?
Yes.
Put an end to it all. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Julie. Bye.